Well, I think we work against ourselves in many ways, and a lot of it has to do with this thought that only economic growth can bring people happiness. Only bigger communities will help because it increases the tax base. We never sit back and ask the question of what the hell are people for? What do you want with your life?
That was Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich in my 2011 documentary, GrowthBusters, Hooked on Growth.
He's a pretty smart guy.
One of the smartest, and we'll hear from him
next.
Calling. Call the GrowthBusters. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Welcome to the GrowthBusters podcast. If you've been wondering why the world seems to be going to hell in a handbasket, this podcast is for you. Can we save it? Stay with us and see what the experts think. I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary GrowthBusters, Hooked on Growth, and chief scientist at the Institute for the Study of Irrationality and Insanity.
And I'm Stephanie Gardner, GrowthBusters board member, environmental law and policy nerd, and sustainable energy devotee. You'll find us at growthbusters.org. Also on Facebook, Twitter, and of course your podcast app for the latest growth-busting news.
Well, Stephanie, before we get to Paul Ehrlich, just a couple of really quick news items. One is I just wanted to let everyone know that we have launched the GrowthBusters Campus Tour. Does that sound interesting?
Yeah, tell me more about that.
We've put together a faculty of some of the smartest minds around the world on the subject of sustainability and numerous subtopics, and offer them to colleges and universities. Presentations to classes, departments, campus-wide presentations, student organizations, you name it. We'll do it virtually, so it's easy to schedule. We'll put a link in the show notes. We've got a special page on the website with information about the faculty and the subjects. And we really want to encourage anyone who might be interested in organizing some kind of a campus event like that to reach out to us. Of course, you can always get a hold of us at podcast@growthbusters.org as well.
That's really neat. I think that's a great idea because it's the younger people, the new generation, all those minds that are absorbing all kinds of information in a college or university atmosphere. They're the ones that need to think about these issues and figure out how they're going to choose to live their lives. So I think this is great. That's exactly why we're doing it. And we've got to get to those minds while they're still open and before they have been completely programmed in crazy and irrational ways by the growth pushers. Exactly. And we've hired a wonderful young lady, Nicole Chow, is coordinating that. And so I want to welcome her to the team, and you'll be hearing more about her in future episodes. Last item on the quick growth-busting news is that Earth Day is right around the corner, and I'm about to head to EarthX, said to be the world's largest annual public exposition of green ideas, products, and new technologies. Tell me more about that, because I've actually never heard of this before until you were kind of invited to participate. That makes you wonder whether it is the world's largest. And green ideas, products, and technologies aren't necessarily my favorite subjects. You know, I'm more interested in simplifying life and getting over our addictions to growth and overconsumption and overpopulation. And products don't really solve that, and technologies don't really solve that either. But I'm always interested in seeing what's there and what kind of people are attracted to attend those. EarthX has been an annual event now for, at least 5 years, maybe 6. And they have a sister initiative, which is the EarthX television network that you can find streaming on the web. And it just programs nothing but environmental-oriented programming. So what is your plan for participating? What will your booth be all about? Well, I'm going to do a booth there for the GrowthBusters podcast. And actually, a benefactor talked me into it and offered to help us out with the cost of doing this. And really, he couldn't say enough good things about EarthX. So I finally relented and said, okay, I'm going to Dallas, Texas. I've got my passport so I can get back in the country. And so I'm going to be promoting the GrowthBusters podcast, but the way I'm doing it is I'm actually setting up the booth as a podcast recording studio, and I'll be inviting passersby to sit down and chat, and we'll be recording material for future podcasts. It'll be a chance for our listeners later to find out what the general public's thinking about all the subjects that we talk about.
And in addition to that, there are a couple of key people that I hope to get to sit down for longer conversations for the podcast as well.
Well, that sounds really valuable. I'm looking forward to, I always love hearing our listener feedback, or the episode where you talked to college students at the University of Denver. I think it's so interesting to get those different perspectives, and it's good discussion material for sure. I think our guest today, who is Paul Ehrlich, you'll introduce him in a moment. I think he talks a little bit about how we're hearing more and more today about especially overpopulation compared to the past. So there are probably other topics that we're hearing more and more about as people become more educated and the climate crisis becomes more urgent. So I love that idea.
Well, I'm hoping so. We'll find out. We'll see just how literate the general public is about overshoot, sustainability, overpopulation, overconsumption, the state of the planet. Speaking of that, we're going to get some pretty informed perspective about the state of the planet from Paul in today's episode. Ehrlich is now 90, retired from teaching, but just as busy as ever. And of course, there's a lot more to his career than this, but he is infamous for co-authoring The Population Bomb in 1969, which really catapulted concerns about overpopulation to what I would call an appropriate level, temporarily, unfortunately.
And he's been a real lightning rod for sustainability conversations. It seems people either love him or hate him.
Yeah, and he's devoted over 50 years of his life to the cause. And so I didn't really want to make him do yet another interview unnecessarily. So in this episode, we're reprising a great conversation that we had with him 2 years ago on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And this was in early April of 2020, just as we were plunging into the pandemic era. Now, Stephanie, you had not yet joined this podcast. My partner in crime at the time was Erica Arias, and she was a really great co-host, and I miss her, although you're doing a great job filling her shoes. Big shout out to you, Erica, if you're listening. But you'll definitely hear from Erica in this conversation. But be sure to stick around, because after this replay, we're going to get a quick update from Paul that was just recorded this week. And I really want to get your thoughts, Stephanie, about what Paul had to say. So take it away, Erica.
Now, I think it's time to go to Paul Ehrlich. As Dave has mentioned, we spoke to Paul on April 10th, 2020.
And this conversation warrants a disclaimer. Paul didn't get to be a lightning rod for heavy criticism and praise in the long-running debates about the unsustainability of economic and population growth by being wishy-washy. Outspoken doesn't even begin to describe him.
That's for sure. And while we try not to get too political on this podcast, Paul has plenty to say about our current U.S. president.
Yep. So if you just can't handle criticism of Donald Trump, then I'm sad to say you had best skip this episode, because we really want to capture the real Paul Ehrlich in this conversation. So we're leaving him uncensored, unchecked.
And we enjoyed every minute of it.
This is a guy who almost needs no introduction, but Paul Ehrlich, being professor of population studies, now Emeritus at Stanford University, founded the Center for Conservation Biology at Stanford and served as its president. He was a guest on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson some 20 times. I'm sure that's more than any other scientist in the history of man. He's been excoriated by growth pushers and profiteers for over 50 years, and he has lived to tell about it. Paul, thanks so much for joining us today. It is a privilege and an honor to get an hour of your day.
It's my pleasure. I never imagined I'd be super busy when I'm almost 88 and retired, and thought that I would be just lying around reading good books, drinking good wine, chasing good women, doing the things that us retired folks ought to do.
Retired? I haven't seen any sign of that. But it's official, huh?
All I don't do that I used to do is meet classes. But of course, now they aren't meeting classes. I get about 200 emails a day from Stanford University explaining all the procedures and so on. It turns out the university is going to partially shut down, but nobody would notice the difference, because it still isn't doing anything at all to solve the problems you and I have been concerned about for all these years. The universities, and I say the same for Harvard, Yale, etc., are still behaving as if their structures created by Aristotle are still wonderful. and not teaching. Good lesson today. Some of you may have heard there's a pandemic going on, and it's crystal clear that many of the educated people in our country do not understand what exponential growth is. It's a beautiful example of the failure of our educational system right up through graduate school.
It is a pretty graphic, real-life demonstration going on right there, isn't it? Your mention, Paul, of Stanford makes me want to jump ahead to a question that I was going to save for if we had time, and that I'm just going to jump on to it. You've retired recently from teaching at Stanford. You have been at Stanford forever, for pretty much your entire career.
Yeah, I came here in 1959.
Yeah. You've been pretty outspoken. You're kind of a bad boy in a lot of ways. Stanford, I want to know, why did they keep you? This is the place where they have the Hoover Institution, and they have Paul Ehrlich.
Well, I can give you my own theory, but there's a large literature. Excuse me, I always need a little gin when I'm doing these things.
I was hoping for that.
The Stanford was pretty much of a finishing school early on. And in the 50s, a president named Wallace Sterling came in, and he had a very bright provost he appointed named Fred Terman, who was the son of the Stanford Binet IQ test Terman. And they decided to turn it into a really world-class university. And they knew that they couldn't at the time compete with places like Harvard, Yale, in terms of money. So what they decided to do was build some, what they called, I believe it was steeples or pinnacles of excellence. They would hire groups of really good people in certain areas and build the university's reputation around them. And it was in part in science and engineering. Terman was an engineer. That's where Silicon Valley came from, and so on.
Wow.
Now, I was outspoken. On the other hand, in those days, a fair number of rich people were concerned about the population problem. They were concerned because there was going to be too many people of the kind they don't like. It was a very racist thing. But bringing in the environment and so on was not really threatening to the establishment that runs our country, to the corporate bosses and so on. And also, the last thing Terman or Wallace Sterling wanted was a fuss with a loudmouthed young professor who they were trying to shut up, because you don't build steeples of excellence and hire excellent people if you have the reputation for not letting them say whatever they think. So I think they thought I was, if anything, possibly a little positive, but certainly trying to stamp on me was not a price that they wanted to pay, particularly since all my colleagues in the department were on my side. I mean, Don Kennedy, who later became the president of the university and was head of the Food and Drug Administration, last 10 years of his career, he was the editor of Science, really big deal. He read the population bomb for me and is acknowledged in it, as are a whole bunch of other important people. So I was pretty well armored against any flack, and in fact got none. I have to say, I've got my complaints about Stanford, as you just heard. But Stanford has been an ideal place for me. They have never tried in any way. When I went on TV and called Richard Nixon a crook, I didn't get a peep out of the administration, particularly because most of the people in the administration thought he was a crook too.
And you were on the Tonight Show probably more than any other professor in the country at the time.
I did something like 20 of them, but Carson, again, tells you about power relations in our society. Carson got the population, the book was sent to him by Arthur Godfrey, who was a very well-known celebrity at the time. He and I shared being pilots, and Carson was really interested in the issues. More importantly, he was arguably the most important personality in Hollywood. Ann and I had dinner with him and Joanna one night in one of the fancy Hollywood restaurants. Everybody who came in felt necessary to come over to John's table and make obeisance of some sort or another. And he was not a He was a relatively shy guy, very nice guy, very, very, very smart. He was the easiest person to work with on all the time I did on TV, and I was a correspondent for NBC News and so on. John was a pleasure to work with always.
Yeah, and I hadn't realized that you had that stint as a correspondent. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sam Hurst and I, and a photographer named Keith Hathaway, did a series of bits over a 3-year period for the Today Show. And we did things on the cattle industry and so on and so forth. Made a lot of trouble, got, I think, an Emmy nomination for it. But we go in the field. I would tell Sam about what I thought we ought to do in science, and he is very, very smart, still involved in trying to show people what's happening to Native Americans and so on. And he would design a shoot. We would go, and I controlled the science. He controlled how we did it, and Keith Hathaway did brilliant photographic work. So the three of us traveled around the world, and we'd take months to do something that showed for 5 minutes on the Today Show. But it was very nice to see the inside of the workings of NBC.
Were there any challenges there with censorship?
Oh, the bigwigs weren't happy with what we did, but the same sort of thing. They wouldn't challenge Carson, and they wouldn't challenge the people that were doing the Today Show when it was a very popular show. But there was a lot of Mickey Mouse going on all the time. The battles between who was going to be the person running the show and so on. And Sam finally got so disgusted with NBC that he went into bison ranching. So that can show you what a talented person in TV finally gets fed up. The trivial battles and the nonsense and the attempts for control from above. But I didn't. Sam, who had been as a combat correspondent in Vietnam, did not take things lightly, and that's probably why we eventually got canceled. I'll tell you one quick story. We were filming in Arizona on the destruction of the western areas by overgrazing with cattle. People who go to a place like Arizona and New Mexico think it's normally barren like that, but of course originally the grass came up to the horses' bellies and more. So we snuck into a fenced-off area, and we're in an arroyo filming the place, which is covered with cow pats, and there wasn't a green blade of anything visible. And along comes a cowboy with 2 6-shooters on a horse, followed by a pit bull. And my instinct was to run, but Sam goes up and gives him a big smile. He says, "What are you fellas doing?" And Sam says, "We're photographing the wildflowers." And he says, "Oh, really?" And he looks around. There's not a blade of grass, not a flower, nothing. And Sam says, "Would you like to be in the shot?" And the guy says, "Yeah." He says, "You just ride off there into the sunset and we'll film you as you go." And the cowboy rode off into the sunset. I was really relieved.
Oh.
So we had good time on our shoots. And I don't see much of Sam anymore, but he was a great guy to work with. He wrote a book called The Man with a Rattlesnake Under His Hat about the snake exhibit in the reptile exhibit in South Dakota in the Black Hills. Great book. And I don't have any financial interest in it. I'm just boosting it.
Paul, I kind of want to just go back to the education system for a little bit, mainly just as someone who will be starting graduate school soon. It was really hard. It was really hard finding people who were interested in studying the relationship between population and the environment. And, you know, in my search, a lot of the articles that I was finding were coming out of just Australia or other parts of the world, but not here. Not very many people are talking about it. And when you bring it up, it's sort of unwelcome. But I guess as somebody who's wanting to study this this topic. Do you have any advice or?
Well, the universities themselves are not usually focused in the right way, but at all universities, like at Stanford, and certainly at Stanford, there are a whole bunch of people who understand the world and are desperately trying to fix something in it. But the whole structure of the university is designed to make that difficult or impossible. The departmental structure, which runs almost everything in most universities, is based on the ideas of an old friend of mine that you may have heard of, but probably didn't meet, a guy named Aristotle. He wrote books a while ago. You can't name a standard department in which you could study any of the major problems of humanity because it will overlap the edges of the department. People say, well, what you need is interdisciplinary work between departments. But the money and the perks all flow down departmental lines. So when they establish interdisciplinary programs, they generally don't do much. Certainly characteristic of Stanford. We have brilliant environmental scientists here doing great stuff, but we have an interdisciplinary program which doesn't do anything. The people in it do things, but as a program, it doesn't do anything, and it doesn't do what needs to be done. That is, every incoming freshman, if they haven't had really good environmental education and mathematical education through their entire L-High system, you can get all the way through Stanford and not have any idea what an ecosystem service is, what the second law of thermodynamics tells you about your life, how many people there are in the world, why the human population has grown so much, what the food situation is. None of those things, you can find out about them if you pick the right course and the right professor to work with, but you'd never get it just coming in at random, going through the standard curriculum in some department. And my advice to you is very simple. You want to go for a PhD program?
I got into the University of Oregon's PhD program, so I'll be working with Richard York, who is actually very supportive of this topic.
I know his work very well, and you've done the right thing. What I was going to recommend is make a connection with a faculty member before you choose the university, because the name of the university is nowhere near as important as who you're working with in it and what his reputation is. And so you've picked exactly the right thing. Mm-hmm. It's also a nice place to live, as opposed to, say, the Northeast, where I once lived, but fortunately fled.
Where did you go?
I was an undergraduate at Penn. Then I did my graduate work at the University of Kansas. Why at the University of Kansas? Because they had the best person working with insects, which is what I wanted to do, in the world at that time. He was a guy that I had met in the American Museum when I was 15, and we remained friends to a couple of years ago when he died at the age of, I think, 95 or 96. So I had that long a relationship with my major professor. We remained friends for, he was, 29 or something when I met him, or when I was 15. And I've been following him and corresponding with him and seeing him periodically ever since. Form a strong bond with your major professor. I hope you've met him.
Yes.
He is a nice guy from my memory of him.
He's really nice. Yeah. The whole department, it was really a great experience. It's
like joining a family.
Yeah.
You can divorce a dozen husbands, but you'll never get rid of your major professor. Just remember that. He'll be a factor in your life forever. People will be asking him about job recommendations and so on for you forever.
Right. Yeah, I like to use that analogy as well. This is probably the only marriage I'll have in my life.
So, Paul, you mentioned your interest in insects. Were you chasing butterflies as a kid? You were kind of a scientific prodigy, weren't you?
I don't know if I was a prodigy. I got very interested. I was interested in nature, mostly from being in summer camps. My parents sent me to summer camps. In a YMCA camp originally in central Pennsylvania. And I liked the nature stuff. And then I got introduced to butterflies and butterfly collecting. And that hooked me. The combination of aesthetics and scientific interest and being able to study the different patterns on their wings. As somebody once wrote, and I can't remember the quote exactly anymore, but it's sort of like the entire evolutionary history of butterflies is written in the patterns on their wings.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see those patterns very easily, and they turn out to be the most important organisms for studying evolution in nature, because unlike fruit flies, which I've worked with and can be very useful, you don't know in nature when you see a fruit fly what fruit fly it is. But with butterflies, you not only know what butterfly it is, what species it is, but you can write a number on its wings and follow it around. I've probably written more numbers on butterfly wings than I've drunk glasses of wine, which is an incredible number of butterflies marked.
Wow. Butterfly graffiti.
Yeah, right.
I don't know too much about butterflies. I think I know more about moths and evolutionary reasons for why they change color.
Oh, the peppered moth story.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's a standard story. You see, you don't really have to say, I don't know butterflies, I just know moths. Butterflies are just day-flying moths. They're a group of moths that manage to get into the daytime niche primarily by becoming poisonous. They're distasteful, and so they're more readily protected from being eaten than the average moth is.
Oh.
If you're into moths, you're into butterflies automatically. They're just moths.
And more beautiful.
Listen, there are some gorgeous moths. Unlike butterflies, I have watched maybe 5,000 moths on a sheet in New Guinea with a black light, and seen maybe there are 400 or 500 species there with incredible patterns, incredible different poses when they land. Hawk moths are gorgeous and fascinating. No, I could get into moths if I started all over again, but butterflies have the advantage for me of great amateur interest.
Yeah.
In fact, the single best paper I was ever involved in science was based on citizen science. That is, on the huge number of people who collect and study butterflies, because they all want perfect specimens for their collections. And the way you get perfect specimens that haven't been flying around and had scales knocked off their wings and so on is by finding the caterpillars, raising them, watching the pupa, the resting stage where the caterpillar turns into the butterfly, and then when it comes out, wait till its wings are dry and then kill it and put it in your collection. But in order to do that, you have to know what plant the caterpillar is going to eat. And when you find that out, you publish a little note in an entomology journal. And as a result of the amateur effort, we know more about the diets of butterflies than of any other large group of organisms of any kind. In other words, the work that Peter Raven and I did on coevolution was based on the efforts of amateurs.
Knowing what's happening to the insect population out there, I'm feeling guilty about having chased down butterflies with a net when I was a kid. And what you just described sounds terribly brutal today.
You say you feel a little guilty about the insects?
Well, do you? I mean, it's probably hard to study them without, a lot of things that you study you don't have to kill.
For most of my studies, I didn't kill. For most insects, you're not likely to damage their populations severely even by killing some of them. They're short-lived as adults, and they can build huge populations easily. But of course, for instance, the populations I studied most intensively for half a century or so on Stanford's campus, we would occasionally take an individual, but 99% of the ones handled were given a mark and released. And that's virtually what I did. But I had no compunction about making collections when I did and where I did, particularly compared to spraying the world with pesticides and disrupting habitats and plowing things down. In most cases, the activities of collectors are not important, but they can be, depending again on the population and so on. I think it's a nice trend started not by me. I can't remember the names of the people who did it, but is moving away from collecting butterflies and photographing them.
Yeah.
And I think that's a generally good thing. It's like when I walk outside here now, I live in the Drool Farm, and we're supposed to be locked down, but you can here legally take a walk if you stay away from people. And when I do, I wear a mask, even though in the number of people I see and the circumstances, I don't think that the masks are much help because nobody's near me and nobody's coughing. On the other hand, I think it's a good message to send. For example, if our president wasn't an imbecile, he would wear a mask on his campaign appearances just to help make it a norm in our society.
Yeah, set a good example.
He might mess up his hair, though.
The same reason I wouldn't collect butterflies, even if they were an important population that I was studying, if it was in a national park, unless I had permission and could do it someplace where no other people would see me, because it's not even if it's legal, it's not a good message to send to be collecting anything in a national park.
So you brought up the coronavirus pandemic, and I don't really want to dwell on it too much, but it would be a crime if we didn't give you a chance to comment on that, because you're a biologist, you've got a lot of expertise in that area, you've written about it, and you know the brightest people on the planet. So what do you think is worth noting about the pandemic that we're in the middle of?
Well, I think there's two things that are worth noting. One, in the short term, and that is in the situation which we have now gotten ourselves into. I don't know a single person, virologist, epidemiologist, so on, that I know a lot of them. I trust them all. Everybody says the same thing. We desperately need a national shutdown and ordered from the top. And we desperately need somebody in charge who doesn't happen to be an imbecile, which are the ones running it now, to make sure that we get the testing kits and the protective stuff out there right now. Don't tell me it can't be done, because I remember December 7th, 1941, when our country was, up to that time, I think it built almost 4 million automobiles. And after December 7th, 1941, we quickly switched the automobile manufacturers to making tanks. And I can remember collecting milkweed pods, the food plant of the butterfly, the monarch butterfly that I worked on intensively, to get the fluff out of them to make stuffing for life preservers for the Navy. And we rationed all sorts of stuff and so on. There was real leadership. The country was mobilized. And now we're being run by a really stupid, narcissistic, evil imbecile who is not doing any of the things that need to be done. Now, you may think of that as a political statement. It sure as hell is. We have, because the second thing is that we're facing a whole series of existential threats that you and we and many other scientists have warned about for decades and doing nothing about it. In fact, Trump is now loosening the cafe standards in order to get his businesses more profits, or the businesses of his buddies more profits, at the cost of killing many, many, many people in the future. Because if you think the health problems of this virus pandemic are serious, they're nothing, absolutely nothing compared to the health threat of climate change. There's no chance, as far as we can tell, that this particular coronavirus will kill everybody, but climate disruption can kill everybody. And we have very little time to act. And instead of acting in the right direction, this moronic imbecile is working very hard to kill Americans and other human beings in the future for his personal gain and profit.
So why do you think the coronavirus pandemic has captured attention like climate change should have and hasn't yet?
Well, I think people can relate to it more readily. After all, their parents are dying, their friends are dying. The news is covered with it. It's global. It's one of the interesting advantages of the web and the level of communication we now have, so that everybody who at least can turn on a TV or turn on a computer knows to a degree what's going on. The sad thing is, of course, the bad planning of the entire world, listening to the idiots in economics who talk about things like perpetual growth, you may have heard of that, or comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is why we don't have a good supply of respirators now, because to the comparative advantage thing is spread production all over the world to wherever the rich people who run the world can find the cheapest labor. So the parts are made everywhere. If you then have a thing like this that starts to break down the international movement system, all of a sudden you can't get respirators made easily. I yelled about this a long time. One of my favorite places is Costa Rica, and they gradually moved away from growing food to take care of their population to growing cash crops for China and US and so if the transportation system based on fossil fuels we shouldn't be burning breaks down, the Costa Ricans may have trouble feeding themselves. The whole idea of comparative advantage has been on efficiency rather than distribution. It was put forward originally by Ricardo at a time when they thought that capital was nailed in place because capital was largely land and labor could move around. And we've now got exactly the opposite situation. You could move $1 trillion of your dollars to Arizona or Australia in a nanosecond now. I wouldn't do it. I'd hold on to your $1 trillion. But you can't move the labor that fast. So how did I get on that rant? We didn't do the planning, and we're not doing any planning now. I'm trying for the world record of rejected op-eds with my colleagues, trying to point out that this is a blip, but what's coming down the road, not just in climate disruption, but also in toxification of the planet, in destruction of soils. A lot of people don't realize how much of their food comes at a distance. Many years ago, John Holder and I did a little calculation of how many Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs it would take to destroy either the United States or the Soviet Union then as functional entities. These are small bombs, 15 kilotons roughly. And we figured about 12 would do the United States and about 9 would do the Soviet Union, because all you have to do is bring down the electricity grid and hit the transportation centers like Kansas City and Chicago and so on, and most people would just starve to death. Because, the whole food supply is based on supply chains that are spread around the world and very, very vulnerable. There's not much food stored anywhere now. The system has to keep working, and the pandemic, of course, is likely to disrupt that system.
Paul, I'm I'm a little embarrassed to say that I just barely started reading your book.
It's ancient.
It's wonderful, and I love it so much. I'm almost done with it, and I'm kind of glad that I haven't finished it yet, just because I get to talk to you. But Dave and I have been talking for over a year about getting you on our podcast, and I've just been really, really excited. So
she has no excuse for not finishing the book by now.
I know.
You know the book that you just showed me?
Yes.
Pick it up and look, I think, in the lower left-hand corner of the front page, front cover. What does it say? There's a little diagram.
It says the population bomb keeps ticking.
Is the bomb ticking?
Yes.
No, it isn't. It's got a fuse. Nobody has ever noticed that.
Just kidding.
The population bomb fuse is still burning, but it's not ticking.
Okay.
Well, that was because they hadn't invented clocks yet when you wrote that book.
Yeah, that's
God,
right.
no.
It was an hourglass. The sand is still drifting, yes.
It's a classic.
But we're obviously talking about the population bomb, and that might be one of your least favorite subjects Paul, but let's talk about it for a minute, because your name doesn't appear in print. You're never introduced without the name of that book.
Yeah.
And I just have to ask you, after more than 50 years, are you just sick of that? Because you've written over 40 books and over 1,000 papers.
I'm only sick of it in one sense. Well, a couple things. First of all, Anne wrote it with me, but Ian Ballantine said that the book will sell better if it only has one author. And I was young and naive, but also, in a sense, right to go along with that, although I am ashamed of having done it in a certain dimension. That's one.
Why only one author?
It just turns out to be true. And you can see how they associate with, if you, they always like a single author on a book if they can get it, and they want to build that name. It's just a marketing thing. I don't know if the publishing industry never takes data, so they may be wrong, but that's what everybody said. And the book did sell something like 3 million copies. So whatever.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that people seem to think that a scientist always believes exactly what he or she said 50 years before. And that, of course, isn't true. And there are a lot of things I would do differently and have done differently in other books since then. And the worst mistake we made was to put in scenarios, which are little stories to tell that may help you think about the future. But every reviewer treated them as if they were predictions.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I would not do that again. But overall, the book did what Ian Ballantine and Dave Brower of the Sierra Club were the two people who asked us to do it,
Mm-hmm.
did what we hoped it would do, and that is it brought the population issue into the environmental movement when it was more or less starting up big time after Rachel Carson.
I have to say, they're very clearly stated as scenarios, hypothetical scenarios, not predictions at all, because you have many of them. You're like,
you're just the fact that people review and don't read the book or lie about it. You know, somebody told me even a president of the United States can lie. So you can't trust everything. You got to remember, I mean, I might be a paid agent of the contraceptive industry. You know, you can't trust me. Maybe there's no population problem at all. You got to figure things out for yourself.
But you do say you forecast that environmental change or just strong efforts towards mitigating some of the issues with, I guess, mainly pollution at the time was something that you were writing about. It's kind of unlikely that unless some economic shift were to occur, we probably won't see strong efforts towards mitigating these issues. And that's kind of where we're at today. You know, COVID sort of has the bull by the horns, and it shifted our entire economic system in a way that's clearing our skies and kind of making room for other species to come out again. And it's kind of the silver lining. So unfortunately, it's, you know, there's a lot more bad than good right now. But do you think, or are you hopeful that more people will use this time to just think about the relationship between, or our relationship with the earth, to try to prevent this sort of thing from happening again, rather than just accepting the inevitable that comes with no changes being made with regards to population growth?
That's why my colleagues and I are fighting for that prize of being the people to write the most and have rejected the most op-eds in a brief period of time, because we have very little time. And unless people learn the lessons from this, after all, pandemics are so tightly tied to demography that to have a pandemic and not discuss population issues is absolutely insane. But we have an absolutely insane society. The New York Times can't ever bring itself to really deal well with population because the people who own it have this as, you know who Noam Chomsky is?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Read what he wrote some time ago about the U.S. media and so on. There are very strict limits within which you can have debates. And one of the things you can't seriously discuss is what is desperately needed, namely a total revision of our economic system. Reversing the last few hundred years of making money the basis of everything. After all, what did you hear when the idiot gets on his afternoon show and says we got to open up the country because we got to get the Dow up? It's the death or the Dow syndrome. We want to go back to super consuming. We want to go back to population growth. And this is followed by everybody. Even people as smart as Obama won't say that we have too many people. We're growing too fast. That is a major factor in our vulnerability to pandemics, and on and on. We don't hear any discussion of, for example, the more and more crowding of human being into what's left of natural habitats and close connection with the other organisms, animals, that are the sources of virtually every infectious disease humanity has ever gotten. That's where they come from. They're diseases of animals in general, and we're animals. And the more people we put in contact with them, the higher the chance is of a transfer. People don't know, for example, that measles couldn't have invaded humanity as a whole until there were cities of something like 50 to 100,000 people. I don't remember the numbers anymore. You have to have large groups for a virus to get in and can stay in unless, if the group's too small, everybody will become immune. There won't be enough susceptibles left and the virus will die out. Measles probably got into human groups many times and just died out until we had such a huge population. Say the same thing for coronavirus. The size of the population makes a wonderful mass of biomass for any virus to invade. And we've managed, by bringing our domestics to huge levels, chickens, pigs, ducks, beef, camels, all of which make us more vulnerable to pandemics. The Chinese pig, pond, duck, human system has long been known as a generator of nasty viruses, and it'll keep doing it.
What do you think it'll take for people to actually have the courage to say something about it?
You want the truth?
Yeah.
Nothing. I don't think there's a chance in hell that we will get the changes we need to keep civilization going. I hate to tell you that, but I don't see any sign of it. Again, the so-called leadership doesn't want to do anything that will cut into their money. It's strictly follow the money. What is it? 0.5% of the population has, I don't remember exactly, but 50% of all of the money. That's what runs things. You have a fully owned Supreme Court. There are 4 people in it who aren't fully owned, but they're going to be replaced. We have a president who is building his own money all the time. What is the chance? Maybe. I'd like to think if the Democrats took over, they could try and transform things. But I have to be honest with you, I can't be optimistic. On the other hand, I'm not going to stop fighting for it. What else is there to do?
Right.
You're starting out young. I've got a plan, you see, to deal with this that you don't have.
What? Do I want to know what that is?
Sure.
It's called a funeral.
I'll be 88 in May. I'm going to die and leave it all to people like you. I had great hopes that I would die before the collapse really got going, but I missed. The smartest thing I ever did was to be born in 1932. Second smartest was marrying Anne.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Well, you should take credit for that. And I'm not asking this to argue, but are there any glimmers of hope today that you didn't see 20 years ago or 40 years ago or 50 years ago?
Well, 20 years ago, we didn't see the interest in the young people, the Greta Thunberg syndrome. And I think they're going to have to go to the streets. I think they will go to the streets. They may actually, Trump has had the wiseness to note that gun shops and shooting ranges are essential, along with golf courses, are essential businesses. It's going to be nasty at some point. And, my daughter lives near Washington, D.C., and I think the odds of me ever seeing her again are very, very small. I don't think that in my lifetime, I'll want to fly on a commercial airliner, my lifetime being, 32 minutes or something at the moment.
Wow.
But remember, I'm a notorious pessimist.
Me too.
Let the optimists get out there.
And yet you never stop trying to help us get this right.
What else can you do?
Yeah.
You may have noticed that you're not getting the growth mania to stop after all your years of trying.
I haven't made any progress, I don't think. It's pretty sad.
You got me.
Yeah, what's your background?
I studied psychology in undergrad, so I didn't really have much of a background in environmental studies. I started getting more of an interest in it just in really starting with studying voluntary childlessness and trying to understand that and why it's important, why I think the movement is important. And it sort of just turned into this more of a personal choice that has global impacts. And then that kind of led me into finding Dave and listening to podcasts. And then I just sort of fangirled Dave and reached out to him and said, I want to be your new co-host. You need a new co-host. I don't have any experience, but can I try?
You're doing a great job. One of my favorite people is Lee Ross, who is a social psychologist who work with Kahneman and Tversky, among others. You probably don't know anything about them, but they're the people who showed how different responses were to the same question asked in different ways, which has got a huge political element in it. And I recommend to you and your listeners, there's a great book by the second author is Lee Ross. Its title is The Wisest Person in the Room, if I recall correctly. And you would find it very interesting in the work you want to do, because social psychology is a big element in why we're not getting the changes that every scientist thinks we should have in the world.
Yeah.
And something to read when you're in your spare time when you're in graduate school with York.
Yeah.
Fascinating subject, and yet we still haven't figured out how to really cut through the roadblocks and the inertia to keep us in place, huh?
Yeah.
You know, I should have thought to look up how many of the books you've written Anne co-wrote with you, because I know she's co-written a lot of the books.
Yeah, most.
Most of them?
I don't know exactly. She goes off on her own track. She's been much more interested and active in working with environmental organizations and trying to keep the science straight there and so on. She's the brains and I'm the mouth, and in a sense, I'm the book pusher. She takes the bad words out of the books
Well, I hope you can talk her into joining us on this podcast one day, because I remember that you and she both were on the panel for the West Coast premiere of the GrowthBusters film, and you were a great pair after that screening.
Well, guess what? You got to lean on her, but she has voice problems and so on, and back problems.
Shoot.
Something happened to the gorgeous young woman I tracked down and married. I don't know what it was.
She's there.
But I know what caused it, because I was asking my colleague Joan Roughgarden, I was saying that, interestingly enough, now my friends are mostly getting sick and dying. And 30 years ago, they weren't. And I don't understand why. And she said, well, I think it's probably climate disruption. Explains it. Is that what's happened to Anne, too, I think?
Yeah, I should write an op-ed about that. So last book question, two-part question. So what do you think is the best book you've written, and what do you think is the most important book you've written?
Well, in terms of the best book, I would say Human Natures, because it deals with the things that most people don't want to look at, how we're dealing with things and why we do the things we do. The most important probably is the population bomb, because it had the biggest impact. Second would be, in that area, would probably be Ecoscience, which we did with John Holdren. And I know that Partha Dasgupta, the world's now best economist since our friend Ken Arrow died, he read it from cover to cover. He's probably the only economist who ever read that book from cover to cover. And he's now working very hard on things like, he's calculated that the world might be able to support 3.5 billion people at our present level. But I mean, that's his level of interest in population and so on. So that's, I guess, where I go. The things that mean most to me are the books I wrote on checker spot butterfly biology and a paper I wrote on butterflies very recently that just interest me. I must say the population problem is horrendous, but it doesn't interest me much because, as you can see, it's so obvious, it's so involved in everything that I don't get many eureka moments. I thought the nicest paper in that area was the one that Winus published with Winus, and I can't remember his partner's name, showing that if you had one fewer child, you saved more greenhouse gas than persuading 24 of your friends to give up driving. Mm-hmm. That was a good one.
We don't have a lot of time left. A couple things that I want to make sure we do. One is, you were helpful in the One Planet, One Child billboard campaign over at World Population Balance. And I want to thank you for your help with that. You gave us a good endorsement and even made some recommendations that helped some people with a little bit of money discover us. Have you seen the results, Paul?
No, not really.
I want to just really quickly show you a photo. Can you see that photo?
Oh, I knew what you were going to put up, but I hadn't seen that. What's the city in the background?
That's Minneapolis. That's downtown Minneapolis right there.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, it's something different. We shared the design and everything, but to actually see that thing in the middle of the big city right next to Interstate 35W with no commuters on it, unfortunately, pretty stunning.
How long will it stay up?
It's been up for a month, and we'll have to raise more money to do it again or expand it, when the time is more right. Our timing couldn't have been worse.
Well, look, no, that goes for a lot of things, obviously. But one of the things that I find cheery is that, first of all, people in Dallas told you it won't work. Well, nothing works. We just have to keep at every edge doing everything we possibly can. And there have been some signs that all of our efforts are working. That is, population is now more in the news and more discussed than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
We're not yet back to where it was in the late 60s, but it's out there and it's coming back. Whether it's coming back in time to do anything, who the hell knows? But we have no choice but to keep going. And if you're interesting, brilliant young women, as you clearly are with Erica, that helps get the young people on board.
Yeah.
And what can I say?
Good advice.
Great advice. Paul, I have one last question for you. What are your top 3 ways of dealing with social isolation right now?
I can tell you very simply, as long as it works. Ann and I have drinks before dinner with friends essentially every night via Zoom.
Nice.
And I talk on the phone to people. I think it's extremely important to keep we're very social animals. And it's very important to keep your social ties up. We're so vulnerable in terms of the demography in your late 80s, both of us with underlying conditions, that we don't dare do any face-to-face stuff. But if we had a sane government, you could probably arrange a country in which face-to-face stuff done carefully and with lots of testing would work again. But again, we don't show the slightest sign that there's anybody actually in the entire administration with an IQ of over 30. It's quite amazing. You got to hand it to Trump. He emptied out the executive branch of the United States. There are more empty suits there than one could possibly imagine. And I
don't hold back. Tell us what you really think.
And one last question. When do you project that this whole thing will go back to what is going to be our new normal?
I'll bet he's learned his lesson on making any kind of, giving any scenarios.
Yeah, I'd like to hope that they can get themselves organized enough so that at this time next year, I will be, if I'm still alive, willing to meet friends in a restaurant under very careful conditions. As a pilot, I could get in an airplane, but I doubt if I will ever again fly in a commercial airliner. But who knows? I hope to be wrong. But let's put it this way. 50 years of predicting the problems with virus epidemics, I wasn't wrong. So what the hell?
That's right.
Well, I am so sad that our time is up.
Well, we can do it again sometime. I love what you guys are doing. Say hello to York for me. He may remember me.
I sure will. I'll be sure to share this episode with him.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us today,
Yes,
Paul.
It's been my great pleasure. Take care. Have a wonderful career. I hope I see you again before you finish your PhD.
Same here.
Okay.
Stay healthy and say hello to Anne from us.
Yeah, give our best to Anne.
I will.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Well, Erica, I'm pretty sure that conversation with Paul Ehrlich will go down as a real highlight of your career, at least so far.
Yeah. I think at the most really important time in history to get an expert like Paul to speak about this crisis that we're all in. Really, really great to have him on.
I regret that we had to let him go after an hour because he had another meeting he needed to attend. And I'm not sorry I did this, but I really didn't steer the conversation too much. I really thought it was important to just let him go where he wanted to go. But what that meant was I really never got around to saying, okay, Paul, where were you and what were you doing on the first Earth Day in 1970? And specifically, would you like to comment on how much progress we've had since then? Must be a lot of progress because there was so much prosperity. So we didn't really get to do that. And it seemed like we ought to do that here on this special 50th anniversary of Earth Day edition of the GrowthBusters podcast. But we didn't do that.
I really enjoyed listening to Paul's personal story and how there was really no outside pressure to censor himself. He was asking the important questions at the time, and I'm glad that he was rewarded for it. I'm so glad that Stanford gave him a place to speak his mind freely and openly.
Yeah, his outspokenness, we talked about that in the conversation with Paul because I had always wondered why Stanford hadn't tried to rein him in. How did he manage to keep that job at that one university for all that time? But, it turns out that his outspokenness is what got him invited back time and time again to The Tonight Show, because Johnny Carson was really afraid to bring a scientist onto the show. He was afraid that if he had a scientist on The Tonight Show, that it would be a dreadful bore. And as you know, there's nothing dreadfully boring about Paul Ehrlich, the guy.
Not at all. Not
He's
at all.
very entertaining. And so that's made him a great guest on The Tonight Show some 20 times, and it's made him a pretty in-demand speaker at college campuses and all kinds of public events for 50 years.
Yeah.
And in fact, you're going to find this interesting, Erica. I was just talking over the weekend with David Trauger, who's retiring from the board of directors of World Population Balance, and I mentioned something about having chatted with Paul Ehrlich a week or two ago, and Dave said, oh, well, if you talk to him again, give him my best. I don't know if he'll remember, but I introduced him when he spoke at Iowa State University back in April 1970 during Earth Week.
Wow.
Yeah, small world.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Really cool.
Yeah, and at first I thought that he was saying that Paul Ehrlich was addressing the campus on the very first Earth Day at Iowa State University. And no, he was saying Paul Ehrlich was in such demand that the best they could do was get him that week. But they had to move that speech from the auditorium to the armory at Iowa State University because there were so many people that wanted to come and see him. He was just so popular. And, the book had been out over a year, and it hadn't gotten very many reviews. It hadn't really gotten the attention that the Sierra Club and Paul and Ann Ehrlich and Ballantine Books had hoped it would get. And it wasn't until Paul shared with us that Johnny Carson read the book and then wanted to have him on the show. Well, once he was on The Tonight Show, the book took off. That was when the book took off. And that was just a few months before that first Earth Day.
I guess one thing I don't know is the Sierra Club was backing this book the whole time?
Yeah.
funding, or?
I couldn't tell you. It could be that the book publisher, was the only one that had to put any money into it. But David Brower was leading the Sierra Club.
Which is really interesting because what was it, their winter issue, where they sort of really downplayed the whole population aspect of all environmental problems.
You're talking about recently, the November-December 2019 issue of Sierra Magazine. Yeah. Yeah, the Sierra Club has changed a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. And chickened out a lot. That's right. You heard it here first. Not first. Sierra Club, where have you gone? What happened to you?
Come back.
Yeah. I haven't managed to find exactly where Paul Ehrlich spoke during Earth Week, other than on April 24th of 1970, he was at Iowa State University.
Neat.
Oh, and this is another interesting thing. Just before the first Earth Day, Paul Ehrlich was invited back for his second appearance on The Tonight Show, and he stayed on the couch and talked to Johnny Carson on the air for over an hour.
Neat.
Nobody gets an hour on the couch. The show's not 90 minutes anymore. Now it's 60 minutes, but that's just unheard of. Okay, so I'm anxious to find out what you thought about that conversation, Steph.
Yeah, well, first of all, I always enjoy listening to Paul Ehrlich's thoughts. I did become familiar with him in my environmental studies coursework, and then when you interviewed him for your documentary about a decade ago, I obviously paid close attention to what he was contributing, those ideas. And he's obviously just very smart, not afraid of ruffling people's feathers. And we need that, right? Like, we need people that are willing to speak strongly in their beliefs about this topic and not tread lightly. So I really appreciate him, have been a fan for a long time. And I had a couple of key takeaways. One was he talks a lot about how the pandemic is a small disruption compared to what's coming from climate change, and how despite scientists warning us about climate change for decades, we really haven't done anything about climate change as a civilization. And by not doing anything, many more people are going to die from climate change than will die from the pandemic. So if we've been able to kind of mobilize and respond to the pandemic in some pretty strong ways to save lives, we need to use this as an example of what we need to be doing for the larger climate change issues that are going to be impacting so many lives and already do impact lives. So that was, I thought, a really interesting perspective.
Frustrating that we can't seem to get mobilized.
The other thing that he was talking about was how easy it is to disrupt the distribution of food and goods now that capital can be moved anywhere around the world to essentially where labor is cheapest. And the pandemic has shown that that's an area of weakness or risk for us, and that we really aren't regionally self-sufficient and resilient anymore. If food couldn't be transported across the country, I think I would probably starve to death in the Northeast, where we don't grow very much food. So it's sort of an eye-opening example of, the pandemic has done this, but climate change also has the power to disrupt these globalized transportation of essential goods all around the world. And we need to be really concerned about this. This is sort of a canary in the coal mine situation.
Yeah, it turns out that cheap products is probably the only benefit of globalization.
Yeah, and they're monetarily cheap,
yeah,
but they have high costs in other ways. And then what I just talked about is pretty depressing and pessimistic. And he's a self-admitted pessimist, but he also has been working at this for his whole career. He's never stopped. He's never given up. And so his message of, what else can you do but just keep working at this and convincing others that this is urgent and worthwhile and we need to be doing something about the impact we're having on the planet. And so I thought that was really inspiring. And I hope that other people are inspired too to not give up and to keep trying. Share this podcast, talk to your elected officials, whatever it is that you do, decrease your personal footprint on the planet. Like whatever you do, like you're still working toward what's the right thing. So I found that message was really inspiring to me.
Yeah, doing the right thing. And I think that this will be a theme that we end up discussing more and more as this podcast goes forward, just because of the way the world is and the way it's going. I thought it was valuable to me that he talked about how he compartmentalizes things, because feeling like there is less and less with each passing year, less and less chance that human civilization is going to get its act together. It is so tempting to give up. How do you have a good life? How do you have any enjoyment? You get the fulfillment of doing the right thing and working on that, but I think you need more than that. And so he continues to enjoy wine and friends, for example. I think that's a good thing to do. Bring on the wine and the friends and the family.
Yeah, in the opening clip, he says, "What the hell are people for?" I think that's a really great question.
Yeah.
What are people for? What is the meaning of being a human being? What brings us value? Is it cheap stuff from China, or is it having dinner with your family, celebrating friendships, participating in your community, helping out a neighbor? Like, what do we care about? What is our humanity about?
Also really enjoyed and found interesting his story about Johnny Carson and the power that he had. And it made me think, what if someone with that kind of power today took up this cause like Johnny Carson did? Johnny Carson really wanted to learn more about overshoot and overpopulation and had the power to bring this scientist on to his show some 20 times or so. Is there someone today who has that much media clout, who could perhaps get this mobilization going just by elevating the conversation to where it should be?
I think that there are people with a lot of listeners, a lot of followers, but are they brave enough? Elon Musk. I hate talking about Elon Musk yet again. But I mean, this dude is he's just in the news all the time. We've talked at length about this in previous episodes. Like, he has the power to do this. He could sit down with our top climate scientists and hash out this on a global stage and inspire change. And he's just doing the exact opposite of that.
Yeah, so I was trying to think of some TV personality or somebody like that, but I think you've hit on it. I'm not sure there is someone on television who has that kind of clout today, because television is so dispersed.
Yeah, maybe Oprah.
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know.
All right, Elon, do the right thing. Now, I didn't want to bother Paul and make him spend another hour rehashing things that he's been talking about for 50 years. And of course, this conversation, I think, was a little bit different. It was nice to get some personal stories from Paul. So I'm kind of glad that we did that. But I did reach out to Paul and let him know we were doing this and invited, I just asked him if he had any current thoughts. Did he want to offer any kind of an update? In my message to him, I said, you can just call the GrowthBusters hotline if you want and record a message for us. And so he did.
It's Paul Ehrlich, and I really feel that we do not appreciate the directly population growth-related phenomena today that are threatening the end of civilization. One is that most people seem to have no idea that a nuclear war is not likely to be contained in any way and is very likely to end civilization, and B, that the U.S. putting huge amounts of money that could be used on good things into the most dangerous of all things, that is modernizing our nuclear triad, because that only increases the chances of nuclear war. One has to always remember that a single one of our missile submarines is quite capable of ending civilization. So it's time to mobilize against nuclear war immediately, while, of course, we have to work much harder to face the other existential threats that are getting more serious daily. sorry to be so negative, but it's a negative time with fascism taking over the United States. Take care.
Gee, what put nuclear war on his mind? Of course, interestingly, nuclear war has always been on his mind. I hear from him about that several times a year. He's always been concerned that that may be the way we go out.
Yeah, I agree with him. I think war is a symptom of exponential growth and Earth overshoot. We're going to be having resource wars. We have too many people and not enough resources. It's only going to get worse. That is a symptom of growth and will be a result of climate change too.
Yeah, and just because I brought up the nuclear part of his answer, I don't want it to get lost in the shuffle there that he did also mention number 2, that we need to be working harder to address non-nuclear existential threats.
Yep, that's a given. And as a reminder, we love hearing listener feedback via our voicemail line or our email address. So you can call the GrowthBusters hotline at 719-402-1400. Or you can email us at podcast@growthbusters.org.
And I promise next episode we'll get back to sharing listener feedback. We've been skipping that for the last couple of episodes so that we don't end up running as long as Joe Rogan's podcast. But we are going to do Honey, I Shrunk My Footprint.
Yeah. I have a 3-fer one that I want to share. So I had some clothes that needed to be fixed. So I had a hem on a dress that had fallen out, and my fiance's ski pants were too long for him, so he was walking on them and they were shredded at the bottom. And then I think there was a pair of pants with a seam that was starting to come apart. So I had to walk, I think, 1.5 miles or something to get to a tailor, dropped off the clothing to get fixed, and then I walked back to retrieve it when it was ready. And when I got there, you know how at the dry cleaning, they always wrap everything in plastic and give you new hangers and stuff. I went in there and I said, I don't want the plastic and hangers. I need to put this stuff in my backpack because I walked. And so, I mean, I don't know if they can reuse those items. Hopefully they'll at least reuse the hangers. I don't know about the plastic, but I basically said, no plastic, please. So the 3-fer was walking there instead of driving, repairing old clothing instead of buying new clothing, and then lastly, not getting any packaging.
Good job.
And I got some exercise, enjoyed the outdoors. It was very nice.
Yeah. It's interesting that my footprint shrinking confession is kind of similar, but way wacky.
Well, yours have gotten really wacky recently. I think you're out of new ideas.
Constantly trying to top the last one. So I mentioned that I'm going to be putting up our booth at EarthX over Earth Day weekend, and I was going to go to the print shop and get this 17.5-inch wide printout. Well, and I thought about it, and I said, you know what? They're going to hand that to me in a big, giant paper envelope. But I said, I'm not going to do that. So I went and rifled through my office supply closet. I said, I've probably got an old envelope that'll fit in. And it turned out I didn't. So I actually had to kind of put a couple of things together. So I actually had a plastic bag that I was going to reuse for trash that something had come in, and a couple of pieces of cardboard from a box that I could sandwich it to protect it and keep it from bending. So I just took my own convoluted packaging into the store, and I told the guy, you're not going to have to give me an envelope. I brought my own stuff to take it. So that's my wacky, Honey, I Shrunk My Footprint. But also, it started a really great conversation. So the guy asked me about the podcast, and we ended up having a good conversation about things that we both do to shrink our footprint. And I was really glad to know that this was a subject that wasn't foreign to him, that he'd actually given it some thought.
Oh, neat.
Yeah. Sometimes doing the right thing rubs off on other people, starts good conversations.
Yeah, that's a good one. Wacky, but good.
So top that one next time, Stephanie. You came close this time. All right. Well, let's wrap it up, shall we?
Yes.
Well, you can learn more about the issues we discuss in this podcast at growthbusters.org. And I've been updating the website a little bit, so there's some new links. So check it out.
Yeah, and the homepage at growthbusters.org is also where you can donate and get on our email list.
And if you do think this podcast is important, be sure to share it with people you love or just people that you think need to learn about limits to growth. And subscribe or follow the podcast on your podcast app so you don't miss an episode.
And thanks to Jake Fader for writing and producing the GrowthBusters theme you can hear at the open and close of this podcast, and to Carlos Jones for singing it.
See you next time. Cue Carlos.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather. But no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling.